I'm happy to moderate this panel, and we have with us today as Christian Muttonen, who is a co-president of the Parliamentarians for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, right? Yes. And she was a president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a few years ago. Then we have Tom Countryman, who is chairman of the Arms Control Association. It's an NGO based in Washington, D.C., and he has a wealth of diplomatic experience serving as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. So that was in the Biden administration, right? So
I came back in the Biden administration for 1 year for one specific task, but it was mostly under Obama.
Yes, and last but not least, Jonathan Granoff, who is the president of the Global Security Institute and the representative of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates to the UN. Right? So what we will do, I'll give the floor to our panelists to give their remarks, and then we have a bit of a discussion, and I hope that we'll also have time for questions from the audience. So then, Christian, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to welcome you here to this special room. I'm really glad we're here, that you realize that the room is called Peace Room. So, and it's not the survival room, it's the peace room. So it's something for like a hope. And hope we need, because what we heard these days very often is that we stand at a critical junction in global history and characterized by all the tensions, the global challenges, the uncertainty and the lack of dialogue. And the foundations of the nuclear stability, which have been constructed carefully over decades, they are now eroding, and this is what makes us worrying. So the choice we have now is we will determine whether we move towards cooperation, whether we move towards restraint, or slip further into uncertainty, instability, or even nuclear anarchy. And preventing nuclear disasters is certainly a responsibility that is due to all the countries, because a disaster doesn't stop at borders. And a single miscalculation, and we know it from history, a single miscalculation, a misinterpretation, a technical failure, everything could have devastating consequences for all of us. I come from Carinthia, which is a lovely part in the south of Austria, very close to the Italian border and to Slovenia. And it takes me 1.5 hours to drive to the Mediterranean Sea. And at the same time, the same distance, you have Aviano, which is a nuclear outfitted NATO air base. If there is an accident in Aviano, then my region would become uninhabitable, and it would have the severe fallout would be on that area. And there is a very impressive Kazakh film on Semipalatinsk, which says where the wind blows, and the wind and the weather to my area, to Carinthia, comes from the south. So if something happens there, then it will be also felt very much in my area. So for decades, nuclear arms control agreements provided the foundation for stability. They were not perfect, but they imposed limits and they built trust. And when I say trust, and this is one of the words I mostly heard these days, trust and cooperation. as we look forward, we must acknowledge the significance of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is set to expire, you probably know, in a year, in February 2026. This treaty has been a cornerstone of the US and Russian arms control for over a decade. And it is the only bilateral arms control treaty remaining in force between those two countries. Recalling that what we have heard in history several times, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, it is crucial that Washington and Moscow prolong the New START treaty, or at least commit not to exceed current levels of deployed nuclear arms, even after February 2026. And that they start negotiations for a new IFN-like treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Arms Treaty. What does this mean? This means that we urgently need to explore the possibilities for common ground. While we have formal diplomatic talks, they seem very distant nowadays. Informal channels have been opened because an arms control cannot exist in a vacuum. So we have to open the channels and get into contact with our counterparts. We have to have a broader conversation. And it is not the one red telephone. We need more red telephones. We need the communication lines on several limits. We need to have them for the decision makers, the political elite, but also the military elite. And this, I think, is very, very important. Given the shifts in global power dynamics, arms control must evolve beyond bilateral US-Russian agreements. China has to be engaged in a structured dialogue in discussions too. And the remaining permanent members of the UN Security Council, France and the United Kingdom, each nuclear power, must recognize also their responsibility and actively support peace negotiations and disarmament efforts. And we heard in the last days, we heard the consideration of President Macron to extend the nuclear shield of France to its allies. And this might seem, at the first view, it might seem as a deterrence against Russian aggression, but I think on the long run, it definitely increases the risk of nuclear tensions and a nuclear war. Therefore, all the key players have to be brought to the negotiation table. And just allow me to say that because we heard it yesterday, and it's always so important, negotiation tables, we have to bring them together, but we have to see if there are also enough women at the table. We shouldn't forget the global south. We never talk about the global south. We also have to take it in the negotiations. As I said before, dialogue, confidence-building measures, transparent communication, diplomatic networking. So diplomacy as such is needed. And having been a parliamentarian myself, I want to also mention that parliamentarian diplomacy is very necessary. And can play a crucial role. The parliamentarian assemblies of the OSCE and the IPU are predestined for that work. So the OSCE is, you already said it, it's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe with its 57 member states we always explained it, from Vladivostok to Vancouver, so including the US and including Russia. And the IPU is the global organization of 181 national parliaments. So what can they do? They can build trust, they can open channels, they can connect and join forces with regional and international NGOs and organizations. For example, PNND, as you mentioned, the Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which is a network of over 700 parliamentarians working together on nuclear disarmament. And they did a lot of side events and events in order to educate and inform parliamentarians. PNND even published a handbook supporting nuclear, together with IPU, a handbook on supporting nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And why are the parliamentarians so important? Just in short, of course, they can push for arms control policies in their own governments. They can influence legislative actions. They are responsible for the budget and for treaties. So for the beginning, this is one important point which I wanted to stress. And in the end, it is diplomacy which we have, the art of diplomacy, to use again, which seems to be forgotten a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, Tom, you were...
Sure. Thanks very much. Because I spent 36 years as an American diplomat, I have incredibly great sympathy for my friends in Europe and elsewhere who are trying to figure out what to make of the United States today. And I hope they have the same sympathy for Americans who have to live in America. The foreign policy statements and actions of the Trump administration are shocking and unpredictable. The domestic actions he has taken are shocking and entirely predictable. They follow the authoritarian playbook that has been described in several other panels here today. But let me try to make sense of what so far the Trump administration means for the future of nuclear arms control, a cause to which the NGO that I lead, the Arms Control Association, is dedicated. So two great points from Mr. Trump so far. First, that he cares about Ukraine about as much as he cares for equality of women. And second, are more interesting comments on denuclearization. Let's break down a little bit what each of these mean for our friends in Europe and around the world. First, the United States has not yet abandoned NATO, and it is not clear that it will. So far, no troops have been withdrawn. The 100+ gravity bombs deployed at Aviano and other sites in Europe are still there, not as a very useful weapon, but as a political symbol of the United States' commitment to Europe's defense. And more importantly, military leaders and Department of Defense leaders in the US are still at this moment reassuring NATO allies that it has not changed. The US wants NATO to be more responsible for its own defense, but the United States is committed as the ultimate guarantor. Now, if they're just saying that out of habit, or they're saying it because the new Secretary of Defense believes it, either way, that's good, but we don't know if it is what the President believes. And we have to assume that even if the Article 5 commitment remains valid, that the dedication of the current U.S. government to that common defense has been called into question, has been weakened. And what does that mean for Europe? Well, the Arms Control Association and my personal belief is that we, the United States, like Russia, like China, rely too much on nuclear weapons as the definition of our defense strategy. And reducing that reliance will reduce the risk of nuclear war. But I also believe you need a strong defense. And in the current time, the defense of Ukraine is the defense of Europe. And for that reason, I hope to see not only Germany, but all the nations of Europe that are still democratic commit themselves to a more credible defense against future Russian expansionism. That's important. It is also important that no one in Europe fall for the logic that if the US nuclear umbrella is withdrawn, we need our own European nuclear weapons. There are people, not just in Germany, but even more loudly in Poland and other places, who have talked about the value of developing nuclear weapons. It is one of the worst ideas you could possibly pursue. First, because nuclear weapons do not increase directly the security of the country that builds them. It makes them more of a target, not less. Secondly, it creates problems of secrecy and of security to prevent those weapons from getting into the wrong hands. And third, it undermines the most important treaty that still provides a little bit of stability to the nuclear world order. That is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And for any major country to pull out of that treaty and pursue nuclear weapons will not be fatal the first time, but ultimately will lead to a multiple-sided arms race around the world. I also hope that Europe will discuss seriously what France and the UK can provide in terms of security guarantees, but not rush into a new arrangement. You might have lost one umbrella, don't go immediately grabbing for a new umbrella, but think about it. I think that President Macron has already done a service by introducing the idea of strategic ambiguity, what he might do to defend European partners into the equation, and that has already added to the deterrence value. So I hope Europe takes that advice. The other point of the hundreds of things that Mr. Trump has said and done, there is one I really like when he says he wants to see denuclearization. That is, the United States and other countries reducing the number of weapons they hold, reducing the amount that they spend on those weapons. And for the US, that is more than $80 billion a year to sustain the nuclear weapons complex. And I think we have to find a way as individual citizens and as world leaders who engage with Trump to encourage that impulse. Now, I don't know if he has the attention span to follow through on what seems to be a sincere desire of his. I am bothered by the fact that very few people in the party that he dominates are repeating his statement about reducing nuclear spending. Still, because it's an optimist, I see an opening. And the opening is not a negotiation of a complete new treaty. We have barely 10 months until the New START treaty expires. It would rather be a simple handshake between President Putin and President Trump that says we will continue to hold our strategic deployed forces to the level agreed in the New START treaty. And then we'll work on other measures perhaps to reduce that level. That's the most we can ask for. And I think it can be done in a way that Europe and the rest of the world should welcome, that is not done at the expense of European security, but instead adds to Europe's sense of security. Many more things I'd like to say about China and everything else, but a couple of quick points. First, not realistic for China to join this initiative at this moment, but we have to keep working on the Chinese, and they need to hear from the rest of the world that the entire world is concerned about their buildup towards the levels of the US and Russia. Second, we can do better on crisis communication, and that's not just red line phones between Washington and Moscow. It includes all 5 P5 capitals. The thought that I'd like to leave you with before our discussion is that nuclear war is unique among existential crises. A global pandemic, use of chemical weapons, use of biological weapons, even the worst scenarios of climate change may kill billions of people, but none of them will exterminate the human species. The only thing we have on Earth that can do that is a nuclear war. And that's why, although I've got a lot of time in retirement, I can only spend half of it on resisting political forces in the US, and I've got to spend half of it pushing back against the risk of nuclear war. Look forward to your questions.
First, I want to thank Jaka for bringing us together. Something came in your heart to call us together, and you said yes to it. And all of us at some point get a call to do something that's ridiculously ambitious, that's really, really of service to others, for which you're not going to get any credit. You're just going to have to go sleepless for a long time. And if you get such a call, say yes, because it's the best thing you can do, and it'll keep you young and energetic like Jaka. So thank you, my brother, for doing this. Oops and bozo. Bozo would be when the United States announced that it was going to invade Iraq, and the people of Baghdad would greet our soldiers with flowers in celebration. My wife said, I don't think so. And when Putin said that he was going to invade Ukraine, and the people of Kiev would greet Russian soldiers with flowers in celebration, I told my wife, I don't think so. Now, if you'd asked any cab driver in Baghdad or Kiev how the invading soldiers would be treated, they would have told you that people would give blood, treasure, and their passions and their lives to fight them tooth and nail. And yet 2 men, as they are today, with not as much common sense as cab drivers in Baghdad or Kiev, have the capacity to end the entire human species in an afternoon. That's the status quo. I call that bozo. Now let's talk about oops. Oops is the intrinsically unstable, incoherent regime that we live under. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said no country can use smallpox or the plague, or smallpox or polio as a weapon. No country can use smallpox or polio. But we'll let 9 countries threaten to use the plague as a weapon to maintain international peace and security. The incoherence of that, the immorality of it, the insanity of it is so clear, right? But that's exactly the regime we have with nuclear weapons. We have 9 countries saying these weapons are good for us and not good for anybody else. That violates the Golden Rule, which is a moral norm for human behavior, and it's therefore unstable, and it's wrong. And the International Court of Justice unanimously ruled that there is a legal duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has a pledge to do so, so it's the legal thing to do. And the vast majority of nations in the world are already both in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but on top of that, they're in nuclear weapons-free zones. So they have belts and suspenders, and on top of that, many of them have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, so they have 2 belts on and suspenders. And they have nice names: Treaty of Tlatelolco for Latin America, Treaty of Rarotonga for the South Pacific, Treaty of Palindaba for Africa, and like that. They're poetic. But I'm a lawyer by profession, and I like to quote greater authorities on the subject to just get a sense of where we are in the world today. So General Lee Butler, who was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, the U.S. Strategic Command, and thus responsible for the targeting readiness of the entire nuclear arsenal of the United States. He was one of the key writers of the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operating Plan, of all of our weapons. And this is what he said. Despite all the evidence, we've yet to fully grasp the monstrous effect of these weapons. The consequences of their use defy reason, transcending time and space, poisoning the earth and deforming its inhabitants. They're inherently dangerous, usually expensive, and militarily inefficient. Now, why are they militarily inefficient? Because if you use less than 2% of the world's arsenals, less than 2%, you throw sufficient amount of soot into the stratosphere that the country using the arsenal would have their agricultural base destroyed, and they would also perish. Wouldn't be immediate, be over a period of years, but it would be pretty painful. So we've moved from mad, now in the science of climate is telling us we've moved to SAD, mutually assured destruction. Now we know it's self-assured destruction. So this is a weapon that is not for use. But for deterrence to be credible, you have to appear and actually be ready to use them. You have to persuade a critical number of young people to be ready to do what is patently immoral, to kill millions of innocent civilians, which violates international humanitarian law. And you have to institutionalize the highest level adversity amongst countries as if it were normal. He said, General Butler said, accepting nuclear weapons as the ultimate arbiter of conflict condemns the world to live under a dark cloud of perpetual anxiety. Worse, it codifies mankind's most murderous instincts as an acceptable resort when other options for conflict resolution fail. I've spent years studying nuclear weapons effects, have investigated a distressing array of accidents and incidents involving strategic weapons and forces. I came away from that experience deeply troubled by what I see as the burden of building and maintaining nuclear arsenals, the grotesquely destructive war plans, the daily operational risks, and the constant prospect of a crisis that holds the fate of entire societies at risk. Missiles that blew up in their silos and ejected their nuclear warheads outside of the confines of the silo. A B-52 aircraft that collided with tankers and scattered nuclear weapons across the coast and onto the shores of Spain. This is a good one. A B-52 bomber with nuclear weapons aboard that crashed in North Carolina. And on investigation, it was discovered that on one of those weapons, 6 of the 7 safety devices that prevent a nuclear explosion had failed as a result of the crash. There are dozens and dozens of such incidents. Nuclear missile-laden submarines that experience catastrophic accidents now lie at the bottom of the ocean. Some of my research. 3 a.m. November 9th, 1979, computers at 3 U.S. military command centers simultaneously picked up over 200 missiles from the then Soviet Union headed for the United States. When the National Security Advisor was just about to call the President of the United States, they realized that it wasn't, and that what had happened was someone had put a training tape into the computers to show a senator how ready we were. And the whole system announced that there was a full-scale launch. June 3rd, 1980, U.S. command posts again indicated a full-scale Soviet attack, and launch crews for Minuteman missiles were given preliminary launch warnings, and bomber aircraft were fully manned. What happened? A computer chip had malfunctioned. Apparently, it had not been, it couldn't distinguish between a sunrise and missile launch. It was just a human error. That kind of is both oops and bozo. September 1983, Stanislav Petrov, a man who saved the world. I think everybody that's alive today is beholden to this man. He was watching the command and control the monitoring center in Moscow, and it showed first a couple of hundred nuclear weapons and then a full-scale launch from the United States. And he didn't pass it up the command and control because he knew that it was very likely that 11,000 nuclear warheads would be launched at the United States and the world would end. So he didn't. So I interviewed him for a Norwegian movie about him. It's called The Man Who Saved the World. And he said, I was a computer engineer. I knew computers make mistakes. And God told me he didn't want the world to end. And then he said that his superiors didn't know whether to reward him for saving the world or punish him for violating his protocols. But what really got them upset at him, and they did punish him, was because he believed in God. January 1995, Boris Yeltsin was told that there was a nuclear launch that would have been a high-altitude explosion, creating an electromagnetic pulse, frying the command and control system of not the Soviet Union, but Russia. And they had activated what we call the nuclear football. In other words, it was just a few steps for him to launch. But he trusted Bill Clinton. He knew Bill Clinton. We saw Bill Clinton last night. I would trust him too. And he trusted Bill Clinton, and he said that's why he wasn't worried. But what if he was drunk? What if he was just, was just angry about a fight he had with his kids or something, that's bozo. I know I'm pretty self-controlled, but I get bad days. What if he'd had a bad day that day? And he only had a few minutes to decide. That's crazy. The fate of the entire human species hanging in the balance of two people trusting or not trusting each other. February 2009, a British Royal Navy nuclear submarine and Le Triomphant, a French nuclear vessel, collided in the Atlantic Ocean. They collided in the Atlantic Ocean. They were carrying nuclear warheads. So under the best, and I could just go on, but under the best of circumstances, the daily threat of a mistake, a miscalculation, a computer hacker creating the perception of a full-scale launch in Lahore, a misinterpretation with Delhi, where they have so little time. I mean, we had so little time. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 13 days. You have less than half an hour between Russia and the United States, but you have less than that in South Asia. So we're in a precarious situation, and anything that we can do to lower the legitimacy and saliency of relying on this ongoing threat is really important. And one of the titles of this was talking about a telephone line. But it's interesting that I actually wrote a proposal with a group of people that included the former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, and Ambassador Robert Gray, who was the ambassador to the Conference on Disarmament of the United States, and Ambassador Thomas Graham, who was a key negotiator in the START Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and William Ury, who was the founder of the Harvard Negotiation Project, who wrote a book in 1985 titled Beyond the Hotline, in which he proposed we should have crisis control centers populated by military experts who were just all the time coming up with protocols and methodologies of evaluating collectively and passing the information on should there be a crisis to lower the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons. So, it's funny that I hadn't thought of reviving it, but who knows? Anything that can reduce the threat, we should push for. And you should all become activists on this, but never become an activist that says, my way is the highway. We need a big tent approach that says anything that moves in the direction of arms control, anything that moves in the direction of lowering the salience of these weapons, anything that strengthens cooperation and trust is good. And we also, in order to get those steps of the good, we need zealots pushing for the moral imperative of getting rid of them. Even if it's not completely realistic, it creates the space for the incremental steps. So that's why Ambassador Countryman understands that when he was in government and I was pushing him, he knew that I didn't expect him to do everything we pushed for. But without people pushing, then you don't get anywhere. So this is an issue that, as I came to the issue when Bobby Kennedy told a bunch of interns in Washington in 1968 that how close we came in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said, if we get every other issue right, and we don't get this right, it won't matter. And that this is the moral and practical litmus test of modernity. We have to meet this test. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. So let me open the discussion. Thanks, first of all, thank you very much for your presentations. But let me ask this question. I think Tom mentioned the NPT and the dangers of the country pulling out of the treaty, the non-proliferation treaty. But I want to ask you sort of your take on this kind of a trend, or that I've noticed at least, that people started kind of accepting the idea of that pulling out of a treaty is basically fine as long as you have some kind of a justification for that. And we've seen that we've seen the discussion of the of nuclear weapons in Poland, Germany. I think I've seen something like Sweden needs nuclear weapons, South Korea, to a lesser extent Japan. And what worries me is that in these discussions, the issue of the treaty actually doesn't come up at all. No. So the people just have this, they discuss the technical details, how this, whether it would make sense or not, and I would agree it wouldn't. But that's I think an interesting and troubling trend here, and it's not isolated. Because I don't know if you follow this, but if you may have seen that just the other day, Minister of Defense of the Baltic states, the Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Poland joining them, the Minister of Defense actually said that we recommend pulling out of the Ottawa Convention, which regulates the land mines. And I think one of the Baltic states, whether it's Lithuania or Latvia, they pulled out of the cluster munition treaty. And I would also note that it all started with the ABM treaty withdrawal, and we've seen the CF, the conventional forces in Europe, the open skies, and all that. So what's your kind of we see the trend. What would be your way of kind of countering that? How do you suggest? Okay, Tom.
I'll start first for the benefit of the people here. Arms control works. Arms control is not a philosophy, it's not an approach, it is national security. And because the US and the Soviet Union began a process of dialogue 60 years ago, we have reduced the number of nuclear warheads in the world from almost 70,000 to 12,000 today. That's still way too many. But both of them cut their arsenals by 85% through bilateral discussions. At the same time, the multilateral discussions that build a consistent architecture across the world are equally important, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at the center of it. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, is an asymmetrical treaty. It says we recognize that these 5 countries have nuclear weapons, but the rest of us promise never to build them. That's a very unusual treaty, and it is unfair, but you know what? It worked. And there are only 4 other countries that have developed nuclear weapons since that treaty. Now, what worries me about the NPT and the state of dialogue in places, not just Iran, which keeps saying, we love the NPT, but if you push us too far, we're going to bust out of it. But South Korea and Poland, there are voices who are saying, we love the NPT, but because we have important friends, we can build nuclear weapons just without even leaving the NPT treaty. This is a fallacy. And I think even the Trump administration is not prepared to tolerate new nuclear states because there is no end to it. Whether you can convince Moscow that adhering to treaties has value even when it's annoying, I don't know. Whether you can convince the dominant political trend in the US that treaties are a good thing when what they see is that treaties tie the hands of the United States, and God damn it, nobody gets to tie the hands of the United States. This is the Republican philosophy that dominates the Congress today. Whether you can change that and get back to a world where people are respecting treaties they signed, respecting the rules of the road, because they make all of us safer. That's the part of what we have to get back to. We've had no meaningful US-Russian discussions for 12 years now, 13. I'm hoping that we can start that up again. I'll say a word later about what the rest of the world has to do.
Okay, Christine.
Yeah. That's obviously a fact that leaders don't agree to or follow treaties any longer, or some of the leaders. So again, coming back to parliamentarians, to civil society, I think this is very important that we create a momentum like there was the peace movement in many years ago, which didn't seem to be necessary anymore, but it is. In fact, it is. And we have to negotiate and to bring together civil society and parliamentarians. For example, when there was the talk about the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear disaster. So the result was a good one because the Red Cross was working together, parliamentarians were working together, diplomats were working together, the administration was working together, and seeing very clearly the humanitarian and environmental consequences of a nuclear disaster, of an explosion, opened the eyes of the people. And I think the difficult thing for the people is when we talk about the technical issues of treaties, which is very important, but we have to push them to open their eyes and see the consequences when a nuclear explosion happens. And I think one thing that I want to mention also is we heard it these days also again and again, education. So I think, for example, the United Nations, they organized a Young Leaders Program, very important to open the eyes of the diplomats, also of the coming young leaders. The CTBTO did the same thing. I met them in Kazakhstan when we had an excursion to Semipalatinsk, how important this is to really to realize. And if this doesn't help, at least the costs are very important to make the people aware what it costs. And allow me just, I'm not sure if it's totally correct with the figures, but PNND and some other organizations found out or calculated that over $1 trillion is being spent to modernize the nuclear arsenals of 9 countries over the next 10 years. $1 trillion, I tried to write it down, you know, this is with the 12 zeros, the figure with the 12 zeros. We all know the crisis of the budgets in the countries. We know we have to meet the sustainable development goals. We have to create jobs. We have to face climate change. I mean, there is so much money. And what they did, and I think this was a very good idea, really, you can't imagine how much money this is. So they had these fake $1,000
No,
notes.
$1 million notes.
Yeah, and
we did it.
$1,000 notes. So if you spend $1,000 a day, you need 2,700,000 years and something else to spend it. Just imagine. And if you spend $1,000 every second, you need a little over 31 years to spend them. Every second. They had those notes, and we tried to put it out. You can't. You just can't. It's so much money. And if the leaders of the world say there is no money left for social issues, then we should push the civil society and make them aware that there is money for social issues, for the sustainable development goals, for climate change. It's just not used in the right way.
Just to add to that, I think the $1 trillion over 10 years, that's only for the United States.
Yeah, it's
That's an old estimate. I think it has
Yeah.
reason.
it's way up. It's
Yeah.
around
It's way
1.9
up.
trillion. You know, some of
And
the things.
another important, to me at least important point, yes, $1 trillion dollars is a lot of money, but for some people it's the profit, not the expense.
The thing is, if it produced security, it would be worth the money.
Yeah.
But the paradox of nuclear weapons is the more the weapon is perfected, the more usable it becomes, the less security you get.
Yeah.
And the worst aspect is, as you pointed out, it creates a constituency that feeds off of the perpetuation of the risk, which creates an institutionalization of existential adversity, thus making it more difficult to deal with other things that require transnational, multinational, cooperative security, like our third lung, the phytoplankton of the oceans, the climate, rainforests, pandemics, addressing poverty. All of those issues are dramatically affected by the fear that these weapons create. And I think in terms of the treaties, I've been thinking a lot about why when some fringe intellectual in a non-nuclear weapon state writes an article proposing that his country go nuclear, it gets huge publicity because it draws eyeballs. Journalists have something to talk about. Whereas when you have a step that strengthens cooperation, it doesn't get any publicity at all. It's like a non-event because peace is not exciting. It doesn't generate dopamine. It doesn't generate clicks. And this is a very serious issue. And last but not least, if the words of treaties are not treated with appropriate respect, then bullets become verbs. So treaties are, well, I like quoting authorities. Let me just tell you what Albert Einstein said. Bullets kill men, atomic bombs kill cities, a tank is a defense against a bullet, but there's no defense against a weapon that can destroy civilization. Our defense is law and order. And the way law and order is achieved between countries is by treaties. There's really nothing more important for our future than treaties.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if we have questions from the audience.
I actually really liked the words you used, and you said something about perpetual anxiety, right?
Yes.
So we have US and Russia. The last two remnants of the smallpox is again with US and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And we come from the global south, as in I come from the global side, I come from India. So how do we then trust all these big, fancy Western nations when they're not even willing to let go of a smallpox trace, which the WHO had said in the year 2010 that keeping it is of absolutely no use for anybody in terms of research or anything. So then how do we, and I ask also this because India was a country which refused to sign the CTBT in 1997. And we obviously had our legitimate reasons because we said, how could we trust? Because we don't know what these big nations are actually going to do. And we have now Trump at the head of it, and of course Putin. So how do you expect the countries in the global south to rally around an NPT or anything at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
Well, they see it in their they see it in their self-interest. That the Treaty of Tlatelolco is a good example. There was an arms race between Brazil and Argentina, and there was a diplomat, Garcia Robles, in Mexico, who realized that if they go nuclear, Mexico would have to go nuclear, and then you'd have a cascade of proliferation. So he gathered the heads of his countries together, of Latin America together, and they said, let's create a nuclear weapons-free zone with spot inspections, and the effect of that has been enormously beneficial. There have been no major wars between any of the countries, and they stopped the nuclear arms race. The same thing happened in Africa because the countries see it as their benefit, in addition to the fact that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but so, as I said, it's because it's in their interest. And from the very beginning, a sixth of the world's population said we won't live in a nuclear apartheid world. And I remember I debated the Minister of Defense before Singh went, and I came back and I told the National Security Advisor and the head of the CIA that India was going to test. 3 months before they tested, the leadership of America actually didn't believe that India would do that. And I said, wait a minute. The BJP ran on the ticket. He said he was going to do it. He has to do it. And they did it. And they asked, I was at a conference, they asked me, how did you know? I said, well, look, their policy is they don't want to be second-class security citizens. So I said, we have to persuade the rest of the world that these are not beneficial. That's the issue. Because India didn't get them because of Pakistan, they got them because of China. And China didn't get them because of India, they got them because of Russia. And Russia got them because of the United States. So it has to be a global approach. Yeah.
I'm a diplomat, or was. I don't trust any government. Not the Russian government, not the Indian government, not the US government. Treaties are not about trust.
Yeah.
They are about a common self-interest. And the advantage that one can gain from marginal cheating on a treaty does not negate the giant benefit you can gain from signing up for the treaty. If New START expires, or even before it expires in February, if Russia goes up from the level of 1,550 deployed warheads to 1,555, maybe we wouldn't detect it. That would be cheating. It would not change the fact that we are capable of utterly destroying each other. So forget about trust. That's got nothing to do with diplomacy.
I think I agree, but to come to the treaty, you have to have trust and diplomacy, because before that, you have to start negotiations, and that's why it is important. I think when you revive treaties, or when you build up new treaties, maybe you should start, with little steps. So not having the whole treaty as such, but starting with limitations for, let's say, Europe or Europe-Russia, limitations in the Indo-Pacific, etc. So to make it step by step, because otherwise it seems to be too difficult to negotiate in that situation, in the one we are now. And you were quoting, I'm quoting. Where is it? You all know this saying by General Bradley. The only way to win an atomic war is to make sure it never starts. I think yes, that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Before I go, let me just add. I think one answer that I would probably give you is that you build institutions, you build support for these institutions, and in that way, this could be kind of that's not necessarily a tangible thing, but when we talked earlier about the kind of this or that treaty disappeared, it's not just the treaty disappeared. It's not just that the certain limits are not there.
Mm-hmm.
No, there is no structure there, and the structure is something that brings you transparency, accountability, cooperation, and by kind of my best answer to that is you weave this web. It's for example, you could see the CTBT, of which India is not a signatory, but Russia is. So Russia signed and ratified the treaty. So, and you could see that as much as they wanted to send a signal that we are ready to do, they still stay the signatory because it's the treaty, it's the organization, it's the international monitoring system, the CTBTO. So it's a, I mean, again, you can imagine that Russia withdrawing entirely with the trend of recent years, but it's more difficult, sort of, and that way you build these things, and then eventually, yes, you get to the point where it becomes just politically impossible to do certain things. And also, you need to, I think you need to respect the treaties and make this point again and again. I had this conversation just recently with some journalist, I think, and she was asking, like, well, what if Russia would just kind of detonate a nuclear bomb somewhere over Novaya Zemlya? I said, no, wait a minute. Russia is a signatory and a member of a treaty that is in force, which is the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits atmospheric nuclear explosions. So you make this point. I mean, again, it will not. I mean, the piece of paper would not block Russia if it would want to do so. But if countries are kind of united around that idea that treaties must be followed, and so there is no nuclear option in Poland because there is NPT. Yep. There is no the option of having a nuclear explosion over Novaya Zemlya, which is because there is the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So you build on that. It's never like truly perfect. Again, we know, but that's more than you would.
I don't disagree with the way nations operate, but building trust is important. During what helped end the Cold War, I was involved in Lawyers Alliance for World Security. We had two former secretaries, two former heads of the CIA, a former Secretary of Defense, a bunch of retired and active diplomats, and we brought lawyers from the Soviet Union to the United States and sent lawyers from the United States to the Soviet Union to build up a culture of communication and human contact.
With my apologies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good hands.
The Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War won a Nobel Peace Prize for what they did. A similar thing, a professional association. Then there was a group that did science, the community, called Pugwash. And Pugwash also won a Nobel Prize for building people-to-people diplomacy. Pardon?
I can. For
You
negotiating
can.
the Prohibition Treaty.
The Prohibition Treaty was largely done by civil society initiatives, a lot of young people, in fact. So citizens can have moral agency in this issue and should exercise it.
Let's do a question right here. You had your hand up, and then we'll try to wrap up, I think.
Yeah, my name is Kashav, and I'm from Pakistan, and I'm one of the 15 United Nations champions for disarmament, and also one of the founding members of City Video Youth Group you were talking about.
Great.
Excellent.
And a volunteer for ICANN, so I've been a disarmament activist for long now. My question, since we're on the topic of treaties, is that we just came out of the third meeting of state parties for TPNW. So I wanted to know, like, how do you see the future of this newly born treaty that we're still under negotiations, taking into consideration that the nuclear deterrence factor is still being discussed in the treaty or in the negotiations? And especially for countries such as mine that are not even the signatory of NPT, and you also mentioned that we need to take into account the global south, and I come from the very global south that owns the nukes. How do we come into play, or how does the treaty that talks about complete elimination of nuclear weapons, how do you see the future of it, and how do you see countries like India or Pakistan, or the four non-recognized nuclear weapon states, connecting to this treaty?
Briefly, none of the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states are meeting their legal obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate a reduction and elimination of their arsenal. None of the 5. They each have a different story as to why it's not their fault. But none of them are doing it. And that's been the case for some years. And so I salute the effort of ICANN, the negotiation of the TPNW, because it was a clear signal, not just from the global south, but from 180 non-nuclear weapon states, to say, we can't wait for you forever. If you are not doing the job you promised to do 50 years ago, we are going to push you with a meaningful treaty. That's important, and I know a number of ways that non-nuclear weapon states can push the P5 to do their job, meet the obligation they signed up for. I don't believe the TPNW is the way to do that. Like any other multilateral treaty, it is an imperfect treaty. It made exceptions for people who demanded this or that. And it is not by itself going to convince the 5 to step up and do their job. And that's why, as much as I'm interested in how the TPNW develops, it is a valuable step. It is not, in my opinion, the crucial step to getting towards the disarmament that we all seek.
I was just with Elisa, the new head of ICANN. Yeah, we did a thing during the negotiations, a side event, and I pleaded with her, and I think she heard me, that we shouldn't say that this treaty is what prohibits nuclear weapons. Current international humanitarian law prohibits the contemplated uses. It prohibits weapons of indiscriminate effect that can't distinguish between civilians and combatants, causes unnecessary suffering, affects neutral third parties, causes irreversible environmental damage, and causes damage far beyond any reasonable military objective. So the contemplated uses are basically already illegal. The treaty codifies that illegality because it looks at the consequences of the use, not the alleged intention with collateral damage and all the other excuses. But there are people advocating and saying the treaty is what makes them illegal. I'm very much opposed to that because I've spent years of my life being an advocate for greater knowledge of and understanding that the real prohibition of the weapons is the fact that they violate international humanitarian law, and military people in almost all the countries in the world, the ones that I've had interaction with, actually have a moral grounding. It's surprising. It's very much so in the culture of the United States that they want to. Many people join the military because they believe they're protecting life, and they don't want to violate. They find it wrong to go kill civilians. So I think it's very important that we keep that standard and keep the argument that the weapons, regardless of the treaty, violate international humanitarian law. If India and Pakistan had an exchange of their arsenals, this is the climate studies that's where they use the examples. It would throw at least 5 million tons of soot into the stratosphere, and people in Germany would all be destroyed. So the people of Germany can't have security as long as India and Pakistan square off against each other. So the NPT is really, really a great treaty. It's really essential. But we need a universal nuclear weapons convention that is that actually has the bells and whistles of inspection, time limits, and all of the other elements, as well as continuing the prohibition based on the fact that they violate the law. Because over time, for example, Syria was publicly condemned for using chemical weapons, even though they're not a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, based on the theory of customary international law. We want to be able to make that case of nuclear weapons. They're prohibited already. We have to get rid of them.
Did you want to comment, Christine?
I just remembered because the treaty started with the Vienna Declaration, really.
Yes.
And I was parliamentarian at that time, and we organized a side event for parliamentarians, because before that there were but there were diplomats and administration coming together, and no parliamentarians. But parliamentarians are important because they make the law in the end. And so I organized a side event in the Austrian Parliament, and we had people from all over the world coming, and so and then we had ICANN, we had the Red Cross. It was really, it really started something. But of course, you have to need more than that. But you can make the people aware what the humanitarian consequences is when there is a nuclear explosion somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, and that it could be a nuclear winter in Germany.
Yeah.
So
let me do 2 minutes to finish my part, and then maybe you guys want to do 2 minutes each. First, all of you should be members of the Arms Control Association.
Yes.
If this is an issue you care about, I've got a couple of our publications and pamphlets here, and I promise you, you cannot join a more prestigious association at a lower annual price. So please think about that. Go to armscontrol.org on the web. Second, I would summarize all the things that both Christine and Jonathan have said as putting it as the good news, bad news. The good news is that the risk of a nuclear war tomorrow or this year is low. The bad news is that it is not zero. It has never been zero in the last 80 years. And the even worse news is that it is probably higher at this moment than at any time in any of your lifetimes since 1962. So the last point I would make, just as so many panels in this conference have talked about the need for citizens in democracy to stand up for democracy as an obligation of being a concerned citizen. Stand up against oligarchs, stand up against repression. In a different way, both individuals and states need to stand up against the nuclear oligarchy, need to say that we will continue to insist and we will not be silent until we have achieved a world without nuclear weapons. Thanks.
I totally agree. Arms Control today, the publication, has no fake news in it. It's not artificial intelligence, it's actual intelligence. It's authentic intelligence. So I commend membership in that. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, gsinstitute.org. We have a pretty good website. We have a lot of the diplomats that did the treaties, post their stuff there, Ambassador Graham, Ambassador Gray, etc. There was a gathering in Australia that a great foreign minister, Gareth Evans, convened, and he had the former Secretary of Defense of the United States and a variety of generals and similar people. And this is a good thing to end on, because this is in your gift. This is in your gift. You're in social networks. You're young. You're smart. So this is probably the youngest audience of any of the things here. And I find that to be really, that's
encouraging.
really good. I mean, it's very encouraging, really, honestly. They concluded there is no doubt that if the peoples of the world were more fully aware of the inherent danger of nuclear weapons and the consequences of their use, they would reject them and not permit their continued possession or acquisition on their behalf by their governments, even for an alleged need for self-defense. I believe that. I believe that if people knew the testimonies of the people who lived through a relatively small device in Hiroshima, the testimonies of the alligator faces, the people whose faces were wiped out, and they didn't have mouths, and they were crying for water as they were dying, how their skin fell off, and that everything was obliterated in a flash, just out of nowhere, just the horrors of it. Or if they went like I did to Semipalatinsk and went to Semi and saw the mutations of babies born with weird limbs, and it's just horrific. Just even the testing. Kazakhstan has over 1.5 million people with leukemias and cancers and birth defects, and the genetic, it sometimes jumps generations. So women from that part of the steppe are afraid to have children. The whole venture of these weapons is so horrible. One of the people who won a Nobel Prize, Joseph Rotblat, was one of the founders of the organization I'm the president of, which was also founded by Mikhail Gorbachev, I might add. But Joseph Rotblat was on the Manhattan Project. And when he found out that the heavy water facility in Norway, which was necessary for the Nazis to build a bomb, he went to Groves and said, we shouldn't build it, because if you build it, you're going to use it. And the rationale for building it was to be a deterrent against the Nazis. But the Nazis couldn't build the bomb. Groves said, we're going to build it anyway. Rotblat said, if you build it and you put it out there, others will get it. And sadly to say, Rotblat was right. He walked off. He won the Nobel Prize in 1995. But I think of it this way. Nuclear weapons are 1930s physics and 1940s technology. And I promise you, technology has not stood still. Technological capacity to do more damage in faster time with less money by fewer people has increased. The technology and the physics have increased. So there's other devices that science and technology have on the shelf. And we know what nuclear weapons do. That's why we have to work for a universal legal prohibition and ending them. That is the moral and practical litmus test of our time. Thank you.
Christine?
Well, thank you. I'm really pleased as well as that there are so many young people here. I think this is very important. You have stay curious, push your parliamentarians, try to wake up the society, and stay tuned, I think you say.
Stay tuned.
Pay attention.
I like stay tuned. Yeah, tune to your consciences.
Well, thank you very much for being here and being engaged in that way. I think we all need that. So this gives hope, being in the peace conference room.
You give us energy.
Yes,
So
you give us
I
energy,
hope we
you give us
return
hope.
some of it.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
thanks.
Thank you.